Hello, and welcome to Aviation 101 with Laura. Recently, I released the part one of this two-part mini-series about Jeppesen charts with SIDs, so Standard Instrument Departures. But now we're going to get into part two, which is all about stars. I highly recommend going back and watching the one about SIDs because I'm going to go into more detail in that video about some of the things charted on these arrivals. And it's going to have to do with that departures part of the two-part mini-series. Now, I also want to bring you guys' attention to my course bundles that are on my website. I might be updating these pricing. I'm planning to because I'm planning to make a SID and STAR course, and that will make the Jeppesen course area more robust, which means I'm going to release another course, which means I typically then, I'm probably going to increase the price of the part 121, 135 interview prep plus Jeppesen so that you guys can take advantage of including the SIDs and STARs in that bundle. But anyway, thanks to everybody who has been buying the course bundles because I feel like it's really helping people and lots of people are going through these bundles. So check it out at this link. All right, so on to stars. What is the difference with a SID and a star? Well, we have a SID shown over here. This is a departure procedure. It is streamlining instrument departures. This one has to do with LaGuardia. And over here, I've got a star also for LaGuardia. So a star is a standard terminal arrival route. That is what it stands for. Okay, and it is intended to streamline the traffic flow into a busy terminal area so that it streamlines it for ATC. We have a defined arrival process, especially for busy terminal areas. And it also does provide safety in the form of obstacle clearance for instrument flight rules aircraft. So let's dive into some of these stars. Now, again, if you go back to my SID video, you will see I'm talking a lot about vector SIDs. That one on the right side you see there for LaGuardia, that is a vector SID. There's really no such thing I've ever seen as a vector star. Okay, a star is always going to be like a defined routing to line everybody up for arrival into that terminal area. All right, so let's start with this one here. That's the same one that we were just looking at in New York. And I want to point out a few things. Of course, you always want to check out the notes and any limitations. And this here says that, yep, it's for aircraft capable of 210 knots or greater. Okay, sometimes it has a note saying it's turbojet aircraft only. Well, that doesn't say this, but some turboprop definitely could fly capable of 210 knots or greater, so then they can go ahead and do this arrival. Another thing I want to point out is it says right here, D-ATIS arrival. So you can listen to ATIS like you're possibly used to, but D-ATIS is a digital ATIS, really cool system where pilots of equipped aircraft can pull up the digital ATIS information and just get like a printout on their flight management system. And it's a digital ATIS, so you don't actually have to listen to it and like copy it all down. Super handy little thing. Okay, so starting with this is, like I said, this is the Milton for arrival, and it can start at various points. I'm going to actually go over here to the part where we have the beginnings of this arrival. And if you take a look at this, there's actually Stony Fork VOR, Keating VOR, Phillipsburg VOR, or Milton VOR. Any of these could be a starting point for this arrival procedure. And once again, it's called the Milton for arrival, okay? So we see everybody funneling in along these dashed lines options. The place where you are the last to join this arrival would be Milton, okay? And I know that because MIP is that identifier, and this is the Milton for, and it's MIP.MIP4. So that would be how I'd file it if I want to begin at Milton. What if I want to begin at Stony Fork VOR? Okay, no problem. But take a look at this, and it says SFK. Notice that's the Stony Fork identifier, .MIP4. Okay, cool. So that is how I could identify where I'd like to begin this arrival, or Keating or Phillipsburg. Now, I am not going to go into detail on all these D and H and VH and L because, okay, if you want to know about that, go watch the one about SIDs because I go into it in great detail in that video. All right. So next we have some other information Notice this part says not to scale. Okay, so we have a not to scale area here. But then you have the rest of this is in fact to scale. So everything inside where you see all these elevation grids, okay, we have our off route obstruction clearance altitudes printed. All this part is to scale, but this part, it says very clearly not to scale. So that part is not to scale. All right. And then along each of these lines, we do have altitudes printed. Now, I do want to make just a comment to explain. This says like flight level 180, okay? Flight level 180, flight level, okay. So notice I said at the beginning a star is a route, okay? There are some of these that I could actually request to fly lower if terrain is not a problem and my aircraft isn't capable of flying quite so high. I could request to fly it lower. ATC may or may not grant that request, but again, this is a arrival route. So you can try to file a star at an altitude lower than what's printed on here. However, I will point out as you get along here, again, we have various altitudes along here. Okay, we have along here also distances. So for example, it is 52.8 miles from Stony Fork to Milton. And it's 68 miles from Keating to Milton. Now, that, again, doesn't look like it makes sense. It's like, well, that's a longer line than that. Well, remember, this part is not to scale. So don't get too hung up on those line lengths. Also, sometimes people ask, like, why is this VOR on here? The Wilkes-Barre VOR, why is that on there? Well, I cannot begin the arrival from Wilkes-Barre. There is no line with actual altitude or distance or the transition filing, or even the radial. I have a radial, but it's a very thin gray line. This is so that I can use Wilkes-Barre to identify, for example, Biley fix, or maybe Billy. And that would be if I am centering on the 195 radial from the Wilkes-Barre VOR. Okay, so these are on here. East Texas VOR, what is that doing on there? I'm from East Texas, and actually I did know there was a VOR in Pennsylvania, weirdly, named East Texas. I have no idea why, but I'm from East Texas, so yeah, what is it doing over there? Anyway, but it is there so that it can provide a reference to these locations. We also have airports marked along here just for reference, okay? And we have various holding patterns. This one's interesting. This holding pattern at Lizzie, it actually says that you have to be a maximum of 210 knots. At 6,001 to 14,000 feet. That's a little different actually than what AIM says, because normally at those altitudes, my max holding airspeed is 230, but for whatever reason, they're limiting it to 210. Now, I also want to point out, like this, expect 10,000, or this, expect 13,000. So you might look at that and think that's odd because the minimum altitude between Lizzie and then Harlem is 8,000, but why are they saying expect 10? That's because these are just expect. This is just information that I should be aware of. I'm expecting ATC to do this, but you could be okay with your reception and terrain clearance if you're at 8,000. All right, and then last thing I just want to point out, in the corner, we have a textual routing box, so I could just read this. Of course, I love the overview of this. And then I have the red circle, that is my MSA. I explain that more in the video about SIDS. But you can see this one is segmented 3,000 on the west side, 2,100 on the east side of LaGuardia VOR, and like other MSAs, it is 25 nautical mile radius. All right, so let's move on to another one. So I've got one from Albuquerque. This one is rather interesting. It serves a couple airports. So again, we have the notes box, always important to look at. This one also serves Double Eagle, K-A-E-G. So you notice here is Albuquerque, the gray circle, but then here's Double Eagle too. So you could use this arrival for either of those two airports. Also, sometimes we actually have a speed requirement. So this one says at Mira, maximum speed of 300 knots. I could fly slower, but maximum speed. And then we have a special note just for turbojet aircraft, expect clearance to cross at 15,000 feet. Also want to point out something. This is something Jeppesen calls a ball flag note. Do you notice the little 1 around the gray circle? That's actually, it's got too congested in this part of the chart. So Jeppesen puts a little note down here. So if you ever see one of those ball flags, just make sure you find the corresponding note, and that is what it's about. So that is just giving me my information for Albuquerque and the elevation and the identifier and the name of the airport. So that's what that is there. Also, this one, we have some terrain. This entire one is to scale, so they don't have to put anything about not being to scale. So that's kind of cool. We also have various along my beginnings of this. So again, this is the Mira 2. All right, notice everybody would have to go over Mira. Okay, and the last point we could join this arrival is at Mira. But I could begin it out here at Tucumcari. I could begin it at Texaco. I could begin it at Chisholm. And at any of those points, you can see again, there is a filing transition fix right there. Okay, but everybody has to go through Mira. So the last point you could be able to join this star is at Mira. Also along these lines, this was not on the one in New York for LaGuardia, but here we do have some altitude requirements for terrain. Okay, so example, along these lines, 12,000 would be the MEA, and let's just focus on this one. 12,000 is the MEA, and then 10,000 with the T, that's my MOCA. So my minimum obstruction clearance altitude. So this gives me, this is a mountainous terrain area, so this is going to give me at least 2,000 foot clearance along that line, and it only guarantees me nav reception within 22 miles of the VOR. But it does at least keep me safe from hitting any obstacles. If I want a full-on MEA, 12,000 feet, and if you're confused with MEA, MOCA, and all this acronyms I'm throwing out, I've got another video about that, so check that out. We also have along these lines a changeover point. So this would be the point, and again, this should be familiar to you from all kinds of en route charting, but the changeover point in this example is 48 miles from Chisholm VOR and 33 miles from Corona VOR. So here we have our distances where I would change to a different navigational aid. And then, like I said, this one shows all our terrain around the area. Again, this is Albuquerque, so we have more going on. Here is a big mountain, and we've got a bold arrow pointing at the highest obstacle in this area, this overview part of the chart. All right, so one more that I want to take a look at, and that is this one going into Boston. Here we have the Ocean 5. I picked an RNAV arrival for us to look at, okay? There is several points on here that are not to scale. So we've got this one, we've got another one down here, we've got another one up here. Okay, so first let's just focus on the notes and check that out, because that is always the first thing I want to check. So this says we need RNAV 1 capability, DME, IRU, that's inertial reference unit, or GPS required. So as long as we have RNAV 1 capability, I can fly this. We also have radar is required, so ATC must have radar for us. Turbojet aircraft only, okay? And then, interestingly, there are several transitions that are only assigned by air traffic control, okay? But like, for example, this one starting at AJ, I could begin that one. It's not an air traffic control only assigned transition. All right, now that we're looking at this part of the chart, this part is not to scale. And I want to point out, this is like one of the biggest holding patterns I've ever seen. 20 nautical mile legs, DME hold. That's crazy, right? It looks so oblong. But at AJ, it's also 20-mile legs. Crazy. How come this holding pattern is so tiny and this one is so big? Because this one is not to scale and this is to scale. It's pretty funny when you actually look at that holding pattern. I just think that's very interesting. Okay. Along this line, so we can have our little RNAV waypoints. Notice they're not triangles anymore because they're not a fix based on like ground-based nav aids. These things are RNAV waypoints. Okay. And then they're going to all funnel in. And let's just choose to follow this path going to AB. Okay. So AB. And we have to actually look. This is a super complicated one because it says essentially we have to, depending on what runway that we are going to, it's going to be different with our arrival, okay? But Yeah, so we have to take a look at what we're doing. Let's example instead of the one with AB. Let's say they're landing on runway 15 right. Okay, so looking over this, if they are landing on runway 15 right, okay, the end of this is going to be Tickman, okay, and that is found over here. So let me zoom in on that so we can take a better look. Okay, so at Tickman, so again, I follow everything into Ocean, okay, Grigio, and we keep going like this, and going along like this. Now, notice at Tickman, we have a circle around our RNAV waypoint, but like at Red Hawk, we don't. So this one, or maybe Red Hook, this one here that does not have a circle, that is a flyby waypoint. I do not have to fly directly over the waypoint, okay? With this one, it is a circled one. That means it is a fly over waypoint. I must fly over Tickman. And then you notice these little triangles at the end of the line. That is for me to then get radar vectors, okay? Also, notice it says we need to cross at 210 knots. It doesn't say expect, it says do it. You guys will do this, okay? And then 5,000, it's like a sandwich over 5,000. What is that about? Well, I pulled up the Jeppesen legend. Again, if you want more info on this, I'm going to PDF a link to the PDF that came from Jeppesen that uses all this, and it's free online. You can download it. But notice this type of, I don't know, I call it like the hamburger altitude. It is 8,000 feet. You have to cross Tickman at 5,000 feet. That's not an expect or some sort of suggestion, what ATC usually does. This one's pretty rigid, so that's what you are supposed to be doing there. Actually, notice nothing on here actually says anything about expecting anything. So they're pretty strict on this. This is what they want you to do. Okay, and then after Tickman, I fly over my waypoint, and then I would expect them to give me vectors, and here's Boston right there. That's where I'm, actually ending up. So let's see. Anything else that I really want to point out on here? Not necessarily. I just notice on here that you do really want to read this and know what runway you are landing on, because it's very important for us to be able to follow that information. Oh yeah, and another fun, weird, big holding pattern here at Loney. That's 10-mile legs. I mean, here's another with 20-mile legs, but it doesn't look like it because, again, that part is not to scale. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was a very fast overview of the highlights of stars. Take a look at that other video about SIDS if you want to get more detail on like the VOR service volumes and the DME service volumes and all those other fun things. Let me know what I missed in the comments. I mean, what else you have questions about stars, and have a fantastic day. From Laura at Aviation 101 with Laura.